A couple announcements. As always, we want to thank Michigan Radio for their support of this lecture series. We're very grateful. And secondly, I'd like to announce that as of 12:57 this afternoon, it is now officially spring. So the vernal equinox did occur, and we're all hopeful that that means what we hope it means. So tonight, Mary Fales joins us and explains how science and academia are working with farmers to protect our freshwater resources as agricultural production increases and intensifies, specifically as related to the Saginaw Bay area. Mary is Saginaw Bay Area Project Director for the Nature Conservancy and comes to the Conservancy following 4 years successfully leading the Macatawa Watershed Project for the Macatawa Area Coordinating Council in Holland. The watershed of Lake Macatawa suffers from many similar issues related to agricultural drainage and runoff faced by the Saginaw Bay area, so that was obviously good experience. And Mary worked extensively there with the farming community to increase the implementation and effectiveness of agricultural best management practices, as well as with stormwater runoff issues. Water is very close to the Institute's heart, so this is a great lecture for us. We do a lot of watershed education throughout the state. She has extensive experience in building a wide range of partnerships and in successful grant writing, including a recent Great Lakes Restoration Initiative Award. Previously, she worked in the Community Water Supply Program for the Michigan DEQ Water Bureau. While at the DEQ, she also worked with concentrated animal feeding operations and with watershed groups in the nonprofit SOURCE program. Mary also adds to the Nature Conservancy's extensive network of Spartans and has an MS in aquatic biology from Grand Valley State University as well. So, Mary, welcome.
Good evening, everybody. Congratulations, you have made it to the first day of spring, and I know it doesn't feel like spring yet, but at least we have March Madness to get us through March, and I know the Spartans are probably still playing right now, and I'm really interested to find out how that turns out. I am excited and honored today to be here at Cranbrook and talking to you about something that I have spent almost my entire career working on, and that is this issue of striking a balance between our farming economy and our freshwater resources that are so very important to the Great Lakes region. So as I go throughout my presentation today, I'm going to start by posing this question: is more better? And you might be wondering, you know, what am I talking about when I'm saying is more better? Am I talking about is more farming better? More freshwater better? I'm really talking about is more conservation better? And that kind of seems like a no-brainer type of question. Of course, we all want to see more conservation on the land, but do we really need all the farmers to be doing these conservation practices? And you know, can we make more strategic choices about how conservation is implemented? So I'm not going to give you the answer to this right away. I hope that you kind of think about this question and digest it a little bit as I'm talking, and then we'll come back to this at the end and kind of get a real solid answer to, is more conservation better? And I guess before I start too, I heard some discussion about what some of these pictures might be, and I'm just wondering if anybody knows what this picture is. Sugar beets, yes, sugar beets. So he mentioned in my introduction that I come from West Michigan in Grand Rapids. We don't really have sugar beets, so one of my biggest learning curves when I came to work in Saginaw Bay Watershed was learning all about how sugar beets are grown. So yes, those are sugar beets. So today I'm going to take you on a little bit of the learning curve that I had to go through in my career. I don't come from a farming background. I wasn't raised on a farm. So there's a couple things you need to know about what's going on with agriculture in the Great Lakes region and in Michigan, what the status is, and what are some of the potential impacts of agriculture to freshwater. And then I'm going to talk about the range of conservation solutions that farmers do have today to address some of those potential impacts. And I've highlighted, you know, my third bullet point here. I'm going to be talking about the importance of being outcome-based in conservation. And as you'll learn as I'm talking today, that the way conservation is done right now, currently with farmers, is it's not very outcome-based. And so one of the things that we're doing at the Nature Conservancy is really pushing, encouraging, and hoping that we can change policies and practices to be more outcome-based, and I'll explain why that's important. And then I'm also going to be talking about some new technology, and if any of you were here last month for Scott Soa's presentation, he talked all about the kinds of technology that we use in the conservation world. I'm going to pick up on some of the things that he was talking about because technology is really important to our agricultural strategy at the Conservancy. And then I'll end with explaining some of the current projects that we have ongoing in the Saginaw Bay watershed. And really, those projects are very, the new funding models are actually very important. So we need to broaden the ways that we incentivize farmers to do these conservation practices, and we're testing some really new and innovative ideas. So I thought I'd kind of zoom way out just a little bit and talk about the mission of the Nature Conservancy. And this was really important to me as I came to the Nature Conservancy about 2 years ago now. You know, I had worked for state government, for local government, for private consulting firms. So this was my first experience at a nonprofit environmental organization. And to understand their mission is really important when viewing it from the lens of working with farmers. So our mission is really to conserve the land and waters on which all life depends. And that was the biggest part of this that was really impressed upon me as I started my career at the Nature Conservancy, is that of course we care about the animals and the plants and preserving biodiversity, but the strategies that we're incentivizing and encouraging have to work for people too. Otherwise they're just not going to be successful. So that is a really important part of what we're doing. And also our vision is really to leave a sustainable world for future generations to enjoy. And the way I tend to explain this, especially when I'm talking to a group of farmers, is, you know, if you're farming today, you want your farm to be just as profitable in providing for your family 5, 6 generations down the road. And to do that, farmers really have to pay attention to what they're doing with their soil. They have to protect their soil health and soil productivity. They have to protect their water resources. And they can't be having more of a negative impact on the community than a benefit. So throughout my talk today, of course, I'm talking about agriculture in the Great Lakes watershed. And the whole watershed is about 300,000 square miles. But that includes portions in Canada and the US. So most of the statistics that I'm going to show in the areas that I'm talking about moving forward in my talk today really has to do with the US portion of the watershed. And that's about 174,000 square miles. And you can see from this map of land cover and land use that, you know, the northern portions of our watershed in the US are primarily forest and wetlands. And then you've got the red areas, which are kind of those smattering of urban areas, but they're all surrounded by the yellow color on this map, which represents corn, soybeans, and wheat. So again, I'm talking about agriculture today. That represents about 37% of the land use in this area. And forest is our largest land cover, but we typically don't get as many impacts to our freshwater resources from forested areas. So I'm talking about the 37% of the land that's covered with some kind of cropland or hayland or pasture. And actually the most impactful type of agriculture is row crop farming, which is about 24% of the land use right now. So looking at agriculture in the Great Lakes in Michigan, you know, right now we've got about 126,000 farms, and that supports a really large agricultural economy, about $14.5 billion. About half of that's coming from crops, half of that's coming from livestock. And the typical crops are what you would expect: corn, soybeans, and hay. And of course our livestock is dominated by dairy. Now if you look at Michigan, Michigan has about 55,000 farms. So we've got about 45% of the total farms in the Great Lakes region. And we've got a little bit, Michigan is more skewed towards crops, about 38% in livestock. And our top field crops in Michigan are corn and soybeans and wheat, but then also sugar beets and potatoes make it into that top 5. We have a lot of dairy cows, as I mentioned, a lot of hogs, chickens as well. And I wanted to show you this graph, which kind of shows our top 20 commodities in Michigan. One that you might not think about, but milk is our largest agricultural related commodity in Michigan. So that makes up about 22% of the $6.5 billion agricultural industry. So we've got corn and soybeans, I've already mentioned, sugar beets, wheat, potatoes, but we've got a lot of other things that help contribute to this economy, including dry beans, blueberries, apples, other vegetables that would include things like asparagus, hay, pickles, tart cherries, of course, in the great Grand Traverse region. So, you know, the take-home message is we're very diverse in our agricultural economy, and we're really second only to California in terms of the crops and the diversity that we have. And just to give you some perspective on how important this agricultural economy is, it's a little bit more than the $4 billion we have in commercial and sports fishery, And it's about half of our tourism industry. And I bring this up because since agriculture plays such a strong part of our economy, and it has the potential to negatively affect our fisheries and our tourism because of the impacts to our water quality, it's really important that we get this right, that we figure out a way to support agriculture and really support successful farmers, but to do it in a way that minimizes environmental impact and impact to our other major economies in Michigan. So agriculture can be a major concern for water quality, but we can't obviously paint with too broad of a brush. There are farmers out there that are doing a great job. A lot of the guys I talk to consider themselves to be, the original land stewards and the original environmentalists. But there are some poor management practices going on, and that's really where you get the water quality impacts, when you have poor management practices. And basically that leads to erosion and runoff, sedimentation, which is really that erosion, that dirt, that topsoil getting into a waterway. And then, of course, excess fertilizer can be a major problem. And I'm probably going to switch back and forth in this presentation between calling it fertilizer or nutrients. Nutrients really include nitrogen and phosphorus, and we typically tend to think of nutrients as a good thing, but too much of any good thing is bad. So too much nitrogen and phosphorus is really the kind of scenario we're talking about where it becomes a problem. So I want to kind of show with a diagram how agriculture can negatively affect water quality. And I'll start out with showing this diagram, which is a healthy ecosystem. So we've got some forest and suburban land use. This arrow represents the runoff going into this lake. We've got nitrogen and phosphorus that I just mentioned, the fertilizers, and they're attached to this soil particle. So fertilizers are typically designed to attach themselves to soil particles. So when you get runoff, you get all of these things in the water. Now, there's not a lot of soil in this runoff, so you still get sunlight that's going down and allowing those rooted plants, and they're creating the oxygen that the fish need in this community. And there's a diverse algae community. It's not overpowered by any one species. So this is kind of what a healthy ecosystem looks like. Now, on the flip side of that, we're looking at a eutrophic ecosystem. So that term just means that there's way too much nutrients in that system, a eutrophic ecosystem. You've got other land uses here that are contributing to a lot more runoff. Industry, potentially wastewater treatment plants, and of course farming. So just by looking at the size of this diagram, you can see that there's a lot more nitrogen and phosphorus and sediment when you've got runoff from these types of land uses. And there's so much sediment that the water is colored brown. This was a big problem too when I worked in the Macatawa watershed. The water was always brown. When you've got brown water, you don't have the sunlight that's reaching the bottom. You don't have these communities providing the oxygen that the fish need. And you've got so much nitrogen and phosphorus that the algae are blooming. And they can just immediately take advantage of those high phosphorus conditions. And this is a kind of a really bad negative loop to get into, because you get a lot of algae blooming all at once, then the algae dies off, and it starts degrading and decomposing, and it saps all the oxygen from the water. So that is when you kind of get some of those situations where you have a really poor fish community, because the fish that we really like to see are the ones that need a lot of oxygen. So looking at some of those poor management practices, one would be concentrated flow. So if you think of how conventional agriculture is done, you harvest a crop in the fall, and that field lays barren for about 6 months before it's planted again. So that's a lot of bare soil. So in those times, in springtime, in winter, you get snow melt events, you get rain events. There's very little vegetation here holding that soil in. So when you get runoff events, this water is taking with it lots of soil and all of those phosphorus and nitrogen particles attached. You can also get the same situation when the crops have grown up if you get large rain events. And so any area of concentrated flow on a farm is of concern. There's also tile drainage, and I'm pretty sure that most of the people in this room probably haven't spent as much time as I have walking agricultural county drains like this. But if you do, you'll notice that every once in a while you'll see these white pipes sticking out. And after rain events, sometimes even for days after rain events, they are running with water. And so what farmers are doing, this is a very, very common practice and really helps a farmer's yield, is they're putting in these tile drains so that they don't have flooding on the farm that's going to impact the crops. They want to get that water moved through the system as quick as possible. So this is also a really great way for dissolved nutrients, so those nutrients that are not attached to sediment, to really short circuit and make it to those county drains, these waterways, very, very quickly. Manure runoff is also a problem. I mentioned that we have a lot of dairy and hogs in Michigan. In this picture, this is showing kind of direct runoff from a feedlot and also pasture land. You know, farmers also have to store this manure. They have to get rid of it. They have to get rid of it all year long, so they're forced to apply it to their fields as a fertilizer source. But if they're not really careful about when they're doing it, if they do it before a rain event, or if they do it on frozen ground that has a large slope, I mean, you can get major runoff events of manure. And so it's not only adding bacteria to the system, but it's another biological oxygen demand. So once it gets in there, it's really zapping the oxygen from the water. Lack of streamside buffer strips. This is unfortunately a very, very common thing that I see all over the place. And basically, you've got this county drain with absolutely no vegetation to buffer it from the kinds of practices that are going on the field. So there's pesticides that could run off, there's fertilizers that can run off. And you might think, well, this doesn't look like anything I really care that much about. I mean, it's just some ag drain. That's what farmers always say to me. Well, it's just an ag drain. We don't really necessarily have to care about that. But, you know, one of the things I always say is this water is flowing downstream, and it's meeting up with the next drain, it's meeting up with the next stream, and it's eventually making it to one of those rivers that you and I all care a lot about. And maybe we do want to swim in those rivers or fish or have a drinking water source or something. So looking into the upper watershed about what's going on in some of these farm fields along these county drains or these ag drains is very important. Bare soil is another big problem. I mentioned that in conventional farming, you have bare soil 6 months out of the year. And I drive back and forth from Grand Rapids to Lansing to work every day, and so I see a lot of farm fields on my drive, and a lot of them are starting to look like this as the snow melts. So this farmer would have tilled in the fall, hoping that they get, their fields to warm up as quickly as possible in the spring and they get that nice seed bed. Or if they've just harvested in the fall, sometimes they can start and they can plow. And you can see that if you get a rain event, this residue from the previous crop is really protecting that soil. Once you plow, you're really exposing a lot of that soil to runoff events, and that can be a problem. So I've just went through a couple of the poor management practices that can be impacting water quality. And basically the end result, one of the end results, are algae blooms in our bays. As again, I said that all of that water is moving downstream and it's all collecting at the end point, which in this case is the western basin of Lake Erie and Saginaw Bay. And this happens to be a picture from 2011 when we had a very wet fall. And with all these nutrients coming off the farm right after the crops were harvested, it allows these algae blooms, and I'm sure most of you have seen pictures like this. So the green in Saginaw Bay and Western Lake Erie Basin are representing the intense algae blooms that we are experiencing that year. And then the darker blue areas are where we've got a lot of sediment runoff. So this picture right here is not a photoshopped picture. This is actually what the water looks like when you have a really intense algae bloom. And when I used to work over in Holland on that Lake Makatawa, I would get calls from citizens all the time, and they would say, there's been a spill of green paint. I mean, that's literally what it looks like. So you can see that this isn't something you'd want to go swimming in, canoeing in, boating in, let your dog drink. I mean, it's a major impact. And I pulled some of the newspaper headlines from the last couple of years. So this is evident to the public. It's not just something that us scientists see and are aware of. So it's happening in Lake Erie, it's happening in Saginaw Bay, it's threatening the walleye population, it's a threat to drinking water. If you've got this kind of scenario, your beaches probably aren't in good shape. So this is a really important problem that is going to start affecting our commercial and sports fishery and our tourism industry. So as a Nature Conservancy, we're looking at, where is the sediment coming from and where are the nutrients coming from, those fertilizer sources. And this is based on a study in 2011 that was actually funded by the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And they found that about 54% of the sediment is coming from these agricultural land uses. And for phosphorus, 61% of the phosphorus is coming from agricultural land uses. So I don't want to minimize the fact that, this purple is what's coming out of urban sources. I'm not going to minimize that at all. There is, but we feel that to get, the biggest return on our investment, we really need to focus on the sources that are coming from agriculture. So what can farmers do to prevent the things that I was talking about, erosion, sedimentation, excess fertilizer? There are a lot of management practices that they can switch to protect and stabilize their soils, to reduce the amount of water running off their fields, and really managing their fertilizer. One of those things that we really encourage is a management form of no-till. So in conventional till, farmers going out, they're driving the tractor a lot. They're plowing up the field after it's harvested. They're plowing before spring. In no-till systems, you don't need to do that. So you can see the previous crop, the stubble from the previous corn crop, is still on the field after they've planted the new corn crop. And this basically is protecting those areas of bare soil. This is soybeans planted into the previous year's crop. And this, one thing that you have to realize about this kind of management practice is it does take a real major shift in the equipment that a farmer has to have, and these planters and tractors are very expensive. So if farmers aren't willing or comfortable with going to a no-till system, there is another system that I think has a lot of benefits, and that would be strip tillage. So in StripTill, you're just tilling in very narrow strips where you're going to be planting the seed for the next crop. So this is a good alternative. You still have a lot of protection of the soil, but the farmer feels good because they're kind of creating a really nice soil bed or planting bed for that seed for the next crop. Buffer strips are really, really, really important. I showed the picture of no buffer strips. This is a good picture of a nice buffer strip. One thing that farmers don't like about this practice is that this is taking a lot of land out of production, depending on how much streamside or stream area they have on their property. So this affects their bottom line. If they're not harvesting crops from these buffer areas, they're not making as much money. So a lot of these things have come with a lot of really hard decisions for farmers. Cover crops would be another one that's really gaining a lot more popularity and acceptance. Cover crops are basically after you harvest your main crop, be it corn or soybeans or whatever, you would plant a crop that's just meant to protect the soil during that 6 months of winter time before you're gonna go back in spring and plant your commodity crop. So this is showing soybeans that were planted into the cover crop, and that was planted in the previous fall, and this happens to be cereal rye. And I love this picture because this is kind of the comparison between what a field looks like that has had a cover crop planted compared to a cover crop that has been planted after harvest. So you can see how much bare soil is there and how great these cover crops are for protecting the soil. And they're actually trapping the nutrients and not letting them leach out over the 6 months of time where you don't have crops on the field. A lot of benefits to the farmer from cover crops as a practice as well. I mentioned drains earlier. There are ways that farmers can better manage those systems, those tile systems, to have less of an impact on water quality resources, and also help them in areas and times of the year where they might need to keep the water on the field. So typically, tile drains are open all the time. They just run free all the time. In this kind of situation, you would have a water level control structure towards the end of the pipe, and in times when you want to keep water on the field, maybe during really hot times of the summer, you can basically raise this gate so you're keeping more water on the field and it's not constantly running out. A lot of these water level control structures are, they need to be manually adjusted by a farmer, but the new thing, the new technology is that you can do this remotely and have it be all digital, and they call that real-time drainage water management. So a farmer can be manipulating the level of these gates on their iPad or their cell phone. So that's really cool new practice coming online. We also really encourage nutrient management planning. So I said before that excess fertilizer is a problem. And we're really encouraging farmers, and so is the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They're encouraging farmers to do these nutrient management plans where they meet with certified nutrient consultants. They do intensive sampling of their farms to find out how much phosphorus, how much nitrogen they really need. And they're doing soil samples to figure this information out. And one kind of new, I guess, branding of a nutrient management planning is this program called the 4 Rs. And the 4 Rs, a typical acronym is really supposed to help you remember what that stands for. The letters are supposed to help you remember what it stands for. And the 4 Rs is a little less helpful because all of it starts with right. So this could be, right shirt, right shoes, right pants, whatever. This is actually looking at the farm and making sure that you have the right fertilizer source, you're applying at the right rate, at the right time of the growing season, and in the right place. So maybe if it's fertilizer that's broadcast out over the field, or it's placed right next to the seed where the seed's going to use it. So this is something that's being kicked off right now. Actually, this week on Tuesday, we had a kickoff event for the 4R programs in the Western Lake Erie Basin, and the crop advisors and the ag retailers, they can get certified. They can be 4R certified, and then the farmer knows that if they're using a 4R certified fertilizer dealer, that they are doing right fertilizer, right rate, right source, right time. And I wanted to mention this too, is this article just came out today, or not today, this week, March 16th, where Walmart is really pushing some of these food corporations to be more sustainable, and they've actually signed on to this 4R initiative, and this is how they want to encourage growers to be more sustainable in reducing their fertilizer uses. So I went through a lot of conservation solutions, a lot of conservation options. This is a big time business decision for these farmers. They're constantly looking at the costs and the benefits and their bottom line. So I don't want to gloss over this. There are a lot of costs to the farmer individually from doing things like no-till and cover crops and buffer strips and drainage water management. Sometimes they need new equipment, and that's very expensive. If you're doing cover crops, you need to buy cover crop seed. You have new management concerns if you're switching from a conventional till system to a no-till or a StripTill. They also might need more technical assistance. A lot of farmers grew up doing things the way their dad did it or where their grandpa did it. So if you switch management practices, you might need a little bit more technical assistance. And then the biggest one, and I've got it here in red, is, I hear this all the time, farmers are worried about these conservation solutions and how they're going to impact their yield. And that's basically their paycheck. So I can't really fault them for that. I would feel the same way. But I think we as a conservation organization and the conservation world needs to better answer some of these questions that farmers have. Of course, there are a lot of benefits to the farmer as well. From doing cover crops, from doing no-till and strip-till, it really improves soil health. Some of these practices take a lot less time in the field. If you're not doing as much tillage, that's less time. It's reduced fuel costs. I mentioned too that if you're doing a practice like drainage water management, or even no-till, during our drought in 2012, the farmers that were doing that experienced a lot less impacts from the weather than farmers that were doing conventional till. Cover crops too lead to less inputs because you get nitrogen that's being secured by those plants. So you could have reduced fertilizer costs. And in the end, I think what every farmer is hoping for is that by showing that they can do these practices and that they're switching their mindset and embracing conservation, that they can have, hopefully, less regulatory pressure in the future. So we've got immediate costs, immediate impacts to the farmer. We've got some long-term benefits. And of course, it's a lot harder to quantify these things than compared to the basic costs that are going to come out of a farmer's pocket. And then there's many, many benefits to society, and those are even harder to put numbers on. But we always talk about improved water quality, improved fishing and swimming. The water's just going to look better and be nicer to be around. A lot of these practices, since they're reducing sediment and fertilizers in the water, can lead to reduced water treatment costs for drinking water. They can increase flood protection for communities, and all of this kind of wraps up into increasing quality of life of a community that is in a rural area. So again, I think as a conservation organization, and this is one of my goals when I'm talking about conservation solutions with farmers, is to talk about the benefits and try to put that into monetary terms. So right now, who's paying for conservation? Because there's a lot of conservation on the ground, and there's basically two ways. Voluntarily, farmers are doing these actions, and that's paid for by them, or farmers can go to the federal government through the Farm Bill programs to get cost share money to put in some of these practices, and so that's basically being funded by taxpayers. So the focal problem, I hope I made this point, that we're pretty confident that we're not just pointing fingers at farmers, that agriculture has significantly altered our freshwater ecosystems in the U.S. And we do spend a lot of money through the Farm Bill on cost share, about $4.5 billion, and $50 million of that would touch base in Michigan. So the perception is that that's a lot of money. That should be enough to get us where we need to be. And that's kind of the main question that the Nature Conservancy is trying to tackle is this really enough? I mean, that's a really hard question to answer. So our strategy for the work that we're doing when it comes to addressing agricultural impacts kind of looks like this. And we want to answer this question, how much is really enough? So we use data and models and analysis to set watershed goals to try to answer that. And we want to provide the technology that's going to help farmers and agricultural agencies measure progress towards the goals that we're trying to set. And I'm going to go through that in a minute. The most important part, I think, here is coming up with innovative incentives, because right now we're relying on farmers to do it themselves, or we're relying on taxpayer money to pay farmers to do it. We're able to be really successful with farmers and get a lot of best management practices on the ground. You still would have a lot of yellow and orange in the pigeon pinnabog. You haven't been able to get to those conditions where the water quality variables are not limiting fish community health. But you made a lot of progress throughout the cast. There's only a couple yellow watersheds left, and the same goes for the Shiawassee. We had orange watersheds. Orange would be kind of moderate amount of impact in the 25% scenario, and those have all been removed in the 50% scenario. So I could talk probably 2 hours on that data analysis and that model, but really the summary or the take-home message from that is that we know what percentage of the land needs to be treated with these conservation practices. We know where they're going to have the most effect or the biggest return on your investment, and it's all outcome oriented. So we know how the fish community is going to respond to implementing those conservation practices. And probably the most important thing that we want to emphasize is that we have a goal. We know how much we can be outcome oriented. So I'm going to get into a little bit about the technology that we use to support implementation of these ideas. And this is the Great Lakes Watershed Management System. We refer to them as kind of our suite of calculators. And it's developed in partnership with MSU, the Institute of Water Research. It's online, it's available for anybody to use, and it looks like this. And you can go in and use it without logging in, or you can create an account so that you could save any practices that you model. And I'm going to zoom in on Saginaw Bay Watershed here. It works just like Google Maps. So you can turn on roads or aerials. I'm going to turn on an aerial and kind of zoom right in on a farm. And this is what farmers find most interesting. Let's say, we're going to work on this field here. We have a farmer who's interested in doing some conservation practices. So basically, I digitized his field, and I'm going to do some field scale analysis. One thing that you can look at with this technology is the erosion risk on the farm. So if you map erosion, you can see that the light brown areas and the dark brown areas are where you're going to get the highest risk for sediment or dirt or topsoil moving off of that farm. And that's really interesting to the farmer. We're, of course, interested in what portion of that topsoil and that dirt makes it to the waterway, and that is the sediment layer. So you can see right off the bat that the dark red areas are where you want to put conservation practices. You should definitely have a buffer strip here. There's a lot of red in this field. Maybe you should do conservation tillage, StripTill. So one thing we can do is we can run some scenarios. So that parcel that I just digitized was about 114 acres. And I'm going to talk to this farmer and I'm going to say, you're doing conventional tillage right now. What would happen if you did no-till with cover crops, which is something we really emphasize. And all of these are drop-down menus. So there's a lot of different best management practices that you could run. You could do just mulch till or just no-till. You could do buffer strips. And in a matter of 10 or 12 seconds, you get the output, and the output is what's really interesting. So from going from conventional till to no-till with cover crops, that farmer could reduce 150 tons per year of erosion from that 114-acre parcel. And what we're more interested in is the sediment loading reduction. So you could reduce 49 tons in sediment going to the nearby waterway. That's a 61% reduction. He has to have a big management change by going to no-till with cover crops, but you can see that it's really worth it for the amount of benefits you're going to get to the waterway. Looking at nutrients, that same scenario, you'd reduce about 97 pounds per year of phosphorus going to that waterway, and that's really the limiting nutrient in Saginaw Bay and what's really important there. So when you click back to that original screen, this is something that the farmers also really like, is that this blue area, my pointer's not working that good, this blue area is digitized, and this is kind of the mini watershed of that farm parcel. So if the farmer's doing no-till and cover crops here, any rain event that comes along, any water that falls here is flowing in this direction. So that practice is having a much larger benefit than just to the farmer. He's treating a much larger volume of water. So this is some big ideas I presented today, a lot of modeling, data analysis. We're actually doing some on-the-ground projects right now where we're putting this into practice. So there's 3 kind of buckets of projects that we can do. One is to try to use the traditional farm bill opportunities that are available to use this information and do it in a more targeted manner. We can use supply chain influences, and we can have a totally different way to look at this, and instead of paying a farmer by acre, we could pay for an outcome. We could pay him directly for sediment reduction or phosphorus reduction. So I'm going to talk about a project that we have in the Cass River Watershed, and this is using the traditional method of farm bill. We're partnering with a couple conservation districts up there, and we basically passed through some funding that we had from the Mott Foundation to support a technician that would go out and work with farmers in these really targeted areas. And they, of course, used our model results. So they said, okay, here's our current condition of fish in the Cass River Watershed. And if we were able to get 25% BMPs on the ground, we would see that we have a lot of improvement, especially in the mouth and along the main stem here. So if we want this to be our outcome, we want to get this situation, where do we have to work upstream of this? And basically we can provide another layer that shows where you get the most fish improvement in the darkest purple areas from implementing these best management practices. So what they're doing is they're using that funding to support the technician, and the technician is going out proactively and recruiting farmers in these areas to do these best management practices. They have got sugar beet farmers to switch to StripTill, which is a big deal because a lot of sugar beet farmers only do conventional tillage. They're doing a lot of cover crop plots and showing farmers the benefits of various, I think it was 50 different varieties or mixes of cover crops. They're doing a lot of wetland restorations and having a lot of farmer education days. And I think that's really important too because, there's some early adopters out there in the community. And if the other farmers can see what those guys are doing and kind of, hear straight from their mouth how effective it's been or how successful it's been for them, it's really convincing to them. So as far as paying directly for outcomes, this is really important, and we're doing this right now in a subwatershed called the Bad River Watershed, and this is part of the Shiawassee River Watershed. We have money from the Great Lakes Commission where over $100,000 of this $250,000 is dedicated to paying farmers to put in these conservation practices, but the big difference is we're not going to pay them per acre. We're not going to say we're going to pay you $30 per acre to do cover crops. We're saying you come in, we use that Great Lakes Watershed Management tool to map what you're going to do and model your scenario, and we're going to pay you per ton of sediment that you reduce. So that's the outcome that we want. We're going to pay directly for the outcome, not just on the amount of acres that you have in a practice, and that's really innovative. We're also working with drain commissioners. So again, in the Shiawassee River Watershed, drain commissioners have a vested interest in keeping sediment out of their county drains because they want to keep the water flowing, they want to keep it moving. We have a vested interest in keeping sediment out of drains because sediment has a large impact to biodiversity and in the fish community. So our idea is, drain commissioners have an annual maintenance fee that they charge to all of their landowners to keep them maintained, to keep the sediment dug out. So if drain commissioners can incentivize farmers to do some of these practices, we're thinking that they can actually give them a discount on their annual maintenance fee. So it's just another way outside of Farm Bill, another option where you can incentivize farmers to do some of these practices, and they can get kind of another financial benefit that they can figure into their cost-benefit analysis. We're also working with the influence of the supply chain. I mentioned before that newspaper headline where Walmart is really pushing a reduction in fertilizer. Walmart has a big impact on a lot of these corporations, and we have a major food corporation right here in Michigan that sources a lot of their wheat for their products from the Thumb area of Saginaw Bay. And what we're hoping to do is work with their suppliers, the local mill, the Star of the West Milling Company. They've got crop advisors working with their farmers. They're going out and they're scouting their crops looking for disease, and they're giving them recommendations on their fertilizer use and selling them seeds. So at the same time, that's a really good trusted relationship that's in place. And at the same time, we're hoping that if we train these crop advisors on how to use that Great Lakes Watershed Management System, that they can also be making conservation recommendations to these farmers and again, using that tool to track progress towards a sediment or a phosphorus reduction goal. So I want to be clear about saying the Nature Conservancy does not do this alone. We do this with a lot of partners that fund us to do this work, and then a lot of other partners that help us actually implement the work. So county drain commissioners and conservation districts, regulatory agencies at the state level, Farm Bureau. We are working with a lot of partners to provide them with the models, the data, the tools, and the ideas for new funding mechanisms. So I'm getting close to the end here, and I want to end with this diagram that kind of sums up our whole strategy when it comes to the agricultural community, and that is this sustainability curve, or this dose response curve. So we know that the more practices we get, the better the fish community gets. If we're at a current condition now with X amount of practices on the ground and we want to improve that condition, we have to figure out how many practices we really need to make that happen. And we provided the tools, those calculators that I showed, to try to help that process along. And of course, there's a cost involved. So the higher you want to go in improving fish community health, the more it's going to cost. And we really have to take that into consideration when we're working with these communities. So is more conservation really better? Seems like a trick question almost. Of course, more conservation is better. But if you go back and look at these maps, you really want, if you have a limited amount of conservation funding, which we do, and it's probably just going to decrease in the future with the way Farm Bill is going, you want to spend your money as wisely as possible. So you want to spend it to incentivize conservation where you're really going to have the biggest return on investment, where it's really this data and this analysis to make those decisions to prioritize where to spend money. So you know that you can make a really good difference in the Cass River watershed by funding conservation here. And maybe you can't really get to those ultimate goals in places like the Pigeon Pinnebog. Doesn't mean you shouldn't work there, but you should realize what your realistic expectations should be. So the outlook is that we really feel confident that if we can get Farm Bill policy and others to kind of switch to this outcome-based conservation strategy, conservation would really be a lot more effective. We're testing our new incentive models, so we're trying to broaden that funding pie and come up with new solutions and ideas for getting conservation on the ground. And again, we're actively trying to work in the Farm Bill. We're working with Debbie Stabenow and the Senate Ag Committee on making sure that we can spend those Farm Bill resources efficiently as possible. And I think what we would ask from the public, and of course you're all here, so you're interested and you're aware of these issues, that water is really precious on our earth, and we have a great resource in the Great Lakes, and we really need to protect that. So now is really not the time to cut funding for Great Lakes. We really need to figure this out and do it right and make sure that we're doing it as strategically as possible with our partners, of course. So with that, I'm going to end my talk today, but I definitely want to invite you to our last and final talk of this series, which is happening on April 24th. And you really, really don't want to miss this, because Chris May is going to be talking about a lot of great on-the-ground restoration he's doing to protect habitat and rare species, and specifically talking about the Erie Marsh Project, which is just fascinating, so you won't want to miss that. So if you want to learn any more about what I talked about today, you can certainly always contact me, but definitely visit our website if you are interested in these issues and want to support the Nature Conservancy and the work that we do. And we definitely work with a broad spectrum of the agricultural community, and I think we've got a lot of really great ideas that are going to be a real change in the future. So I hope you've learned something today. I hope this was educational, and I'll certainly take any questions that you might have.
Something about the Pigeon River area, the soil, that different from the other areas, or was just the practices that were?
Basically, it's the percentage of agriculture in the Pigeon Pinnebog. So we've got this kind of spectrum of different watersheds. There's very little agriculture here, maybe 20%, and then it kind of spans to the Pigeon Pinnebog, which is about 82% in agricultural land use. So it's just, the landscape is so altered that the effects are really hard to combat. So that's basically the major difference.
How receptive are factory farmers to the Nature Conservancy viewpoint?
Well, I think I'm going to give you a surprising answer. So I did used to work for the Department of Environmental Qualities, and I worked with these CAFOs, so the Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation. These guys are pretty with it. They've got a ton of eyes on them. They have a lot more requirements than small or medium-sized family farms. So they're not opposed to some of these ideas, and they usually have more income, I guess I'll say, so they can afford to spend money on some of these things. I think that we have, in my experience, more of a challenge with small and medium-sized farmers who are maybe a little bit less exposed to the new practices and more entrenched in the way that, you know, their dad did the farm or their grandpa ran the farm. So I have more challenges actually with the small and medium-sized farmers as far as convincing them to make the investment to do some of these different practices.
What's the ratio between the small and the large?
I'm going to, there was one thing that I deleted from here, and I was going to talk about that, but there's actually more small and medium-sized farms than large farms. If I can find it real quick. It's up here. Unless I deleted it. It was on this slide. I deleted it. I think it's about 70% medium and small and 30% large. Number of, oh, well, the small and medium was done on an acreage basis.
You also address manure runoff, manure management, and runoff.
What was your question again? So you're asking about manure management and runoff.
Yes.
What specifically about that?
I would investigate anyway also.
Oh, yeah. So I mentioned manure runoff as a potential problem, and that is actually encompassed when you do a nutrient management plan, because manure is really a nutrient that farmers use. They use it as a fertilizer. So if they've got a nutrient management plan in place, they know where they need that as a fertilizer source. And we do recommend not applying on frozen ground, having those buffer strips in place so that if you do have a runoff event, there's some vegetation there to catch it. So it is part of the practices that we're advocating for. Back there at the hat.
The buffer strips you talked about, is part of your part of your recommendations to use native forbs, plants like that, that also create corridors.
Exactly.
Diverse zones, and obviously plants for pollinators. Is that part of it?
That is part of it. I didn't mention it specifically, but that is part of it. And another benefit from having buffer strips and native vegetation is for pollinator habitat, which is really important to farmers. So they can get cost share through the Farm Bill if they're creating that pollinator habitat, and that's one way that they can do it is by putting in those buffer strips.
Have they ever thought that someone using these larger buffer strips as grazing for animals?
I would say no. Most of them would not use them for grazing, but some of them will cut the vegetation and use it as a hay source. But they have to do it at very specific times so that they're not impacting nesting birds and things like that.
So your models that you're using are mostly predictive at this time. When do you expect to get results back from your practices?
So you're talking about like maybe on-the-ground monitoring or on-field monitoring. So the models are actually based on a long history of peer-reviewed research. There's many organizations who, like MSU and Purdue and Ohio State, where they go out and they do plots of cover crops and filter strips, and they actually look at how it impacts runoff and nutrient loss and sediment loss. So all of that long history of peer-reviewed research is in the model, basically. So we feel it's very well-vetted data and well-vetted information. The way we would measure the impacts is by going back and looking at the thing that we really care about, which is the fish community health. So over time, if fish community health is improving, then we know that those practices are working.
Do you have a timeline for that? Like within the next 3 years you'll start monitoring?
Well, the monitoring that I showed is actually done by Wisconsin DNR and Michigan DNR, and they do it on a rotating basis for all watersheds in Michigan. So it's kind of nice because we don't actually have to go out and do the monitoring, but we can rely on their monitoring data sets, and they do that continually. And I think for most watersheds, it's about every 5 years that they'll go back out and do the fish community sampling. Any other questions? Yeah, right there.
In the whole farm bill, I heard that they feed farmers to let fields lie fallow. It was good for wildlife. Did that make it into the new?
They still have that. Yep, they still do have that as a program. Was there a question over here? Yeah.
Yeah, so when you slide showed that like 30% of the impact comes from urban areas, Conservancy working in that effort?
I would say in Saginaw Bay and the Western Lake Erie Basin, the Nature Conservancy as an organization is not necessarily working on those sources, but those urban sources do have a lot more regulatory tools that can be used by state and local governments to help control runoff and point sources and industrial wastewater discharges. So we just don't see it really as our role. We're looking more towards agricultural sources, which aren't as regulated and needs a lot more incentives, different strategies to help. There was somebody over here that had a question, yeah.
Could you click on slide 7?
Sure.
Flora Culture, you skipped that. What is Flora Culture?
Flora Culture would be a lot of the greenhouses and the plants, the annuals, the perennials that they produce. A lot of greenhouses in West Michigan, where I'm from, large operations. Go ahead, yeah.
Position does the Nature Conservancy take on genetically modified crops?
We kind of, it depends. Typically, you won't find the Nature Conservancy saying absolutely no to anything. There's a lot of organizations out there that do deal with GMOs and genetically modified crops, and that typically isn't an argument that we get into. So we're really looking at the environmental impacts of any agriculture, no matter what they're growing. Over here.
Are there any programs where they're, for some of these farmers, who they can't afford this new equipment, where they're shared equipment?
That's a great question. Actually, some equipment dealers, you don't have to actually buy equipment, you can rent it. So farmers in a community will have to figure out who rents it on what days. There's also projects that we've done in the past with different conservation districts where we've gotten private funding for them, for the conservation district, which every county has one, to buy this kind of equipment and then rent it out to farmers on a very reasonable basis. However, through the Farm Bill, through cost share programs, none of those programs would cost share farmers buying new equipment. So it doesn't happen through the Farm Bill, but it does happen in a variety of other ways. Right here.
For the best management practices, when you have the consultants go out, is there like a cost benefit analysis, like really the best way to spend money at the end of
Yeah.
that will really keep the runoff?
Well, for pest management, I would say that the buffers don't come into it as much. But when you're looking at nutrient management and the amount of fertilizer and how much and when and what rate they apply it, that's the easiest way you can do a cost-benefit analysis because phosphorus and nitrogen sources are very expensive. And if you can be very prescriptive on what you're applying and where you're applying it, you can really show farmers some benefits to their bottom line. Filter strips because you're taking land out of production and they really can't crop anything off of those acres. So some things it's easier to do the cost-benefit analysis with.
So the cost benefit analysis for those nutrient advisors, are they free?
No. Those are all private industry. They're crop advisors. They charge for their services. They charge for coming out and do the soil sampling so they can make their recommendations. But a lot of farmers are doing it, and for some Farm Bill programs, it's required that a farmer has a nutrient management plan. Any other questions?
Would there be any way to make these buffer strips also profitable for the farmer? Let us say they grew something in there that would be totally stripped off the land but could be useful, such as orchard-type plants.
I haven't seen it with orchard-type plants a lot, and you don't actually get as much water quality protection from orchard plants as you do from like a really thick forb type of community.
I've been combining the two.
Yeah, that could be done. I'm not familiar with that I don't think it's done as much, but I did mention that some farmers will mow and hay it so that if they do have livestock, they can use that as a feed source.
Oh, then it wouldn't be as useful to retain water.
Well, you wouldn't mow it. You don't actually plow it, so you're just mowing it. So you do have 5 to 6 inches of vegetation that's still left there to be a buffer and a filter for any water runoff that's occurring. There's somebody back there that I keep skipping.
Ensures that the buffers remain, that someone doesn't decide the next year to buffers.
That's a good question, because with the increasing prices of corn, a lot of these farmers who have entered into, if they get money from the Farm Bill to put in a buffer strip, they usually have to sign like a 10-year contract. But they can get out of those contracts, and if the price per bushel of corn or soybeans goes high enough, some farmers, I've seen it, makes more sense for them to pull those buffers out, pay the penalty, and plant the commodity crop so that they can capitalize on that extra yield. So typically they have a contract signed, but they can get out of those contracts. Okay, last question.
One of the reasons why we have very few or hardly any pheasants in Michigan anymore is because of the close farming and the elimination of hedgerows, what you would call buffer strips. So do any of the farmers think about putting in pheasant chicks, for example, and then charging hunters to shoot that land? There are farmers in South Dakota and Iowa and other places in the Midwest that have basically turned their farms into, they've given up farming, and they're now raising the right kind of crops and the right kind of birds, and they've converted themselves to areas for hunters.
I think you have to find the right kind of farmer, and they are out there, the ones that do value wildlife and do have, they're into hunting themselves and they want to provide that habitat. So there is a Pheasants Forever initiative where there is some Farm Bill money for improving wildlife habitat, and so they can get cost share money for that too. And I'm sure that some of them probably charge to people who are hunting on their land, but that's another kind of avenue or an angle where you can kind of talk about the benefits of conservation, and one that I actually forgot to put in my slides, but that is another benefit. Well, thank you everybody for coming. I appreciate it.
One of the things you didn't talk about, because it wasn't pertinent to your discussion, but it must be pertinent to